Good evening, everybody. Happy Sunday and welcome back. You know, I almost thought it's kind of a joke to say Happy Sunday when we got back-to-back sermons on depression. I had more than one of you tell me after this morning, I didn't come in depressed, but I am now. So you are the truly brave ones to come back and hear some more. No, this is an important topic, and it's one that we all need to seek a greater understanding of. And if we learned anything, maybe it was just that more people than what we thought deal with depression. And how good to know that you're not alone in that. None of us are alone in that. And by better understanding it, not only can we help to bring ourselves up out of it, but we can help others as well. And we want to be there to support each other. That's what church family is for, what it's all about. So as we continue tonight, we are going to try and apply what we learned this morning to a specific case study. If you remember, we had the slide about men and women in the Bible who may have dealt with depression. One on that list was Elijah, and I think he's one of the easier ones to study just because of what is revealed as it relates to this topic of depression. And so we're going to spend our time here going through 1 Kings chapter 19. It's such an interesting study because Elijah, he is this hero in the Old Testament. He's the prophet of fire. You remember, he's the one that James and John, talking to the Messiah, they want to be like him. Shall we be like Elijah and call down fire from heaven? And so he is seen universally, I think, as this hero of God. But just as true as it is to say Elijah was the prophet of God, I think it's also true to say he was a sufferer of depression. He dealt with depression. And 1 Kings 19, I believe more than anywhere else in the Old Testament, reveals this about him. Now, we kind of have to remember what leads up to this chapter. It's in 1 Kings 18 that we have the showdown at Mount Carmel, and we've studied this before. I think you're familiar with this account. This is where the prophet Elijah says, "How long will you falter, or how long halt ye between two opinions? If Baal is God, serve him, but if Jehovah is God, serve him." And you remember on Mount Carmel, they have this challenge that is issued. Elijah's alone as far as the prophets of Jehovah God, and he's against hundreds of prophets of Baal. The challenge is, let's see who is the true God. Let's see who brings fire. And so they prepare their sacrifices, they prepare their altars, all the necessary ingredients are there except for fire. The prophets of Baal go first and they petition their imagined God. They petition the false god Baal over and over again. No fire comes, and we are not surprised, for there is nothing in an idol. But when Elijah prepares for his turn, not just with the altar and the sacrifice and all things there, but even soaking the altar, the sacrifice, and a moat around it filled with water, he petitions God one time. Jehovah God brings the fire. Not only does it consume the sacrifice, it consumes all the water all around and the altar itself. We see undeniably that Jehovah is the one true God. Well, after some of the conflict in these big events and the showdown at Mount Carmel, evil Queen Jezebel makes a vow that she will destroy Elijah. She thinks of nothing but killing him. And this is one of many pieces leading in toward Elijah's depression. Now, as we go through this, we're not going to go strictly verse by verse. We're going to jump around just a little bit, so I beg your patience for that. The way this is arranged, I want to look at all of the negatives first. And so we're going to be hopping down through the chapter, looking at all the negatives. These are the causes of Elijah's depression, and also verses that show problems in his thinking, verses that show where he might be using one of those cognitive distortions in the way he's viewing these events and these situations. Then after we go through all the red verses, all the negatives, then we're going to look at the positives. And so there's going to be a little bit of a restart, and we're going to go through and we're going to see all the depression remedies provided by God. And again, we're applying what we learned this morning and what we laid out in this morning's lesson. And so that research should help us in better understanding what takes place here. Okay, so we're looking at the negative first. The start of the chapter shows that Elijah was in an intensely stressful situation. 1 Kings 19, look at verse 1 and 2. And Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, also how he had executed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, "So let the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time." Now make no mistake, this is a vow, an oath of sorts that Queen Jezebel makes. And notice what it's compared to. The prophets of Baal who had been put to the sword, the prophets of Baal who had been killed, she says, so let the gods do to me, kill me, and more also, if I do not make your life, Elijah, your life, as one of them, the dead prophets of Baal. And so this is, if you want to put it in kind of different phrasing, it's like a death pact. Either I'm going to die or you're going to die. One of us is going to die. And so Jezebel thinks of nothing else but killing Elijah. I'm going to make your life as one of the dead prophets of Baal. And notice the time element here. By tomorrow, about this time. So not only is she intent on doing this, she wants to do it quickly. She says, your days are numbered, Elijah, and the number is one or less. So if you think about the event, the showdown at Mount Carmel, that was an exciting, I'm sure, adrenaline-packed challenge. The time that Elijah spent there was, you can't compare it to anything else. That can create in him such strong emotions, such strong feelings. Have you ever been in a situation where it felt like your heart was literally going to come out of your chest? I think Elijah probably felt that way through a lot of these times. But we need to remind ourselves also that it wasn't just this event, the showdown at Mount Carmel, that was the climax of a long situational conflict. How many times through this period had he had conflict with Ahab and Jezebel? Quite often. And it's in chapter 18 and verse 17 where Ahab, in speaking to Elijah, calls him the troubler of all Israel. Now, of course, Elijah is able to say, it's not me that's troubling Israel. It's you. It's you and your wife. It's this terrible policy of trying to bring in idols and worship them alongside Jehovah God. That will not work. Don't forget how through this time God had pronounced that there would not fall rain upon the land. This was a drought as a punishment. Through this time, Elijah had been many days in the wilderness. You remember God was feeding him by use of ravens. And so this is a long, drawn-out situation of tense conflict, and then it comes to a head in such a climactic event. You get both pieces here leading towards very strong emotion, and it is a high-stress situation. So all of this plays into some of Elijah's thinking. You look at the next two verses, and you can see withdrawal is really at play here. 1 Kings 19, verse 3 and 4, and when he saw that is Jezebel's threat, he arose and ran for his life, and went to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a broom tree, and he prayed that he might die, and said, it is enough. Now, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers. Okay, so he makes this journey, fearing for his life. He goes from Mount Carmel and the areas around, now to the land of Judah, the region of Beersheba, is what's mentioned there in the text. Notice this at the end of verse 3. He left his servant there in Beersheba, and then Elijah continues on by himself in the wilderness. And sometimes there's these little hidden characters in the Bible. They're kind of behind the scenes, and these little figures, these smaller people, we don't think about them quite so much. Well, you remember Elijah had a servant. He had one who was there with him when he prayed to God that rain would come back after God said that period was over. It was the servant that Elijah sent to the end of the hill to go and to look for the clouds coming to bring the rain. And so he did have some companionship, although it was very limited and they were in isolation much of their days. But here he leaves the servant behind. Now he's going to be truly isolated, truly by himself. And so apart from going away from the people and going away from Ahab and Jezebel, he leaves his servant behind. He goes on further into the wilderness, and he is withdrawn from everyone and seemingly everything. Now in the wilderness, he comes to sit down under a broom tree. That's the way the New King James translates this word. Most people figure this is a juniper tree, so don't let that distract you or throw you. He's sitting under the juniper, and he prays that he might die. He says, it is enough. Now, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers. Now, I will admit to you, you can see that he's thinking about death. But I want to caution you against something here. I've heard some preachers, I believe, get a little too cavalier and they say Elijah was suicidal. I don't believe that's the case, and I think we need to be very careful about using that word. He has an understanding that he will be taken care of by God. And although you do see him feeling maybe helpless and hopeless, he does not have designs to end his life himself. That's why he's praying that God would go ahead and take him. And perhaps he's thinking of something like an Enoch situation. Enoch was not, for God took him. I don't think there's enough in the text here for us to say that he thought of ending his own life. No, he prays to God that he could be done with time here on this earth. And that's not the same thing. So I want to caution you against being a little bit too cavalier with the language there. But he is thinking about death, certainly, and you can see feelings of worthlessness. The last phrase there at the end of verse 4, I am no better than my fathers. There's a feeling here of just having no strength, and you kind of see that emotional exhaustion, maybe physical exhaustion playing in here as well. I'm not stronger than them, I'm not better than them, I'm not more faithful than them, and really just the admission, I can do no more. Now, as you continue reading, eventually God starts to ask him some questions. In the answer that Elijah gives, and he gives the answer twice, you can see a little bit more of his negative thinking at play, and I want us to really examine those. You scoot down to verse 10, and we see the hopelessness on display. And make no mistake, feeling hopeless, that is trademark depression. I mean, that is what we need to understand it as. If you are feeling hopeless, that is a good description of that three-part negative like we talked about, the triad there. So 1 Kings 19 and verse 10, this is Elijah's answer. So he said, I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life. And I want you to think about the definitions that we talked about. When we were trying to lay out depression this morning, it was marked by no longer having an interest in the things that you once took joy in, took pleasure in, having trouble going to work and concentrating on taking care of the task that was set before you, just a general loss of interest and a feeling of hopelessness. Can't you see that present in the statement that he makes here, in the words that he issues? And this idea of depression to negatively affect how you feel, how you think, and the way you act. Yes, this is all right here. What Elijah is feeling, what Elijah is thinking, and the way he's not able to act, or at least according to him, he's not able to act or do anymore, this is depression. Now, a couple of verses ahead, he says almost the exact same thing. You'll find that God repeats this question to him, and in verse 14, we find much the same negative feelings. Elijah said, I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts because the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life. Now, that phrase, I alone am left, stick a pin in that, put that to the side. We're going to be right back there. We're going to see that in just a minute. But I want to talk for you a minute about Beck's triad. You remember we talked about Aaron Beck and the negativity triad, so it's negative feelings about yourself, negative feelings about others in the world, and negative feelings about the future. I think you find them all present in Elijah's statement here. The negative feeling about himself, yes, he was zealous, but he's about to die, and he's alone. And so really there's no positivity as far as Elijah is concerned, according to him. What about others? What about the world? Well, the children of Israel, they've forsaken the covenant. The children of Israel, they've torn down the altars to Jehovah. They've killed the prophets of Jehovah with the sword. And then as far as any prospects of a good future, he says, look, it's just me and I'm on my way out. And so there's no hope for a positive future. You have every part of that triad of negativity right here. But as we noted, as we talked about this morning, God has an answer for every one of those. God has an answer as far as any negativity you might have towards yourself. He certainly has an answer toward negativity for the world. And what better future could we have than a future with God? And so there needs to be an understanding, not just of how these problems came about, the causes and the different thinking that led Elijah to depression, but we also need to understand the remedies provided by God. And this is where I really want us to draw some emphasis. We're turning the page now. Now let's get positive. In verse 5 to verse 7, you can see God caring for Elijah, and this speaks to two of the preventions or two of the remedies that we talked about, getting outside and eating healthy. Look at verse 5. Then as he lay and slept under that broom tree, juniper tree, suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, Arise and eat. And then he looked, and there by his head was a cake baked on coals and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came back the second time and touched him and said, Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you. So as Elijah is leaving Jezebel, and as he's going to the wilderness, and as he's going to see all the things that God will show to him, this is the prep work. And I think it's very important for us to notice what God takes care of first. God takes care of these physical signs and symptoms of his depression first. Do you remember we had that slide with a great long list? It was 18 or 20 things. And we noted how at the beginning in the left-hand column, it was more about your feelings and your attitude. And then in the other column, it was more about physical signs, the external in your actions and your behavior. Well, as you're coming out of that, you kind of have to do just the reverse. You have to take care of the physical actions and the behavior and the external. And once those are cared for, then you can get around to correcting the thinking that had gone wrong. And that's the way God deals with Elijah. Now, I don't want to disappoint anyone here, but the word cake as it's used is not cake as you and I use it today. I'm sorry, Kitty. This is bread. This is bread. Make no mistake. It's not sweet bread. It's not cake. But it is something that would fortify him. It is something that would provide the body strength. And don't miss also that, the food and water, it's provided twice. Can you see that there in the text? And so he gets this cake, the bread that had been baked on coals, and a jar or a cruse of water. And then verse 7, the angel of the Lord came back a second time after he had had some time to rest, some time to sleep there. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and woke him up again and said, "Arise and eat." So it's provided once again that he would have the things necessary for the body. Sometimes when you and I are dealing with depression or when we're trying to help someone who is dealing with depression, I think we try and jump the gun or we try and get the cart ahead of the horse. We want to say, "Hey, you're thinking wrong about this. Snap out of it. Don't you realize this is the case? Don't you realize such and such has always been that way? How could you get so wrong in your thinking?" Slow down. We have someone who is stuck, someone who is just paralyzed. And whether they're chained to the bed or chained to the couch, whether they've been sleeping way too much or haven't been able to get a wink, they need these physical things addressed first. You can say some really smart things to them, but they're not able to even hear those things. They're not able to consider those things. And if you're the one who's dealing with it, if I'm the one who's dealing with it, we're not ready for that. And so we have to first be prepared to change the thinking. We have to be strengthened for the work ahead, for the task ahead. And yes, it is work to come back up out of this downward spiral. And so I think it's very interesting what God takes care of first. He's out in nature. He's out under the juniper tree. He's allowed some time to sleep, and he's brought food and water. He's got some good things. And so we need to remember to get outside to eat healthy. If you go to just the next verse, this is just kind of fun. I sort of forced this one in on the text. Exercising. Look at verse 8. "So he arose and ate and drank, and he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights as far as Horeb, the mountain of God." So when you exercise, 40 days and 40 nights, you need to walk. He did have some time to exercise, and I'll tell you, if you're the one who likes to go for a walk, you know that that's great time to contemplate. Great time to think about different things and to have a more measured reaction to the things that happen. Right? When people are talking to us and when events happen in our life, we have that immediate knee-jerk reaction. And if we never stop and consider, that's the only thing we have. And we just sort of carry through with that, even if it's wrong as wrong can be. And so some time spent doing a task or walking for a set pace of time, that gives you time to consider, to weigh the options, to say, is this actually the case? To do some of that, challenging your cognitive distortions like we talked about. And so it is a very good thing. If you have trouble just listening to the silence or you need something to listen to as you're walking, let me stick in a plug here for the Light Network. The Light Network has some very good Christian podcasts. You can have either a straight Bible lesson or more talk show type material that you can listen to, but all with a biblical base to it. Allow those good things to flow through your ears and through your mind as you're out on your walk. These will be very helpful to you. So that's our little plug for exercise there at verse 8. Now, I really want you to notice this. The two questions, we saw earlier Elijah's answer to these questions, and it showed his hopelessness, showed his negative thinking. This fits into the category of watching for triggers. And I want you to notice with me verse 9, but then also verse 13. And it's amazing here, the patience that God shows. We have an amazingly patient master. Verse 9, There he went into a cave and spent the night in that place, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And then down in verse 13, it's a little bit further ahead. So it was when Elijah heard it, the commotion there, he went out and stood at the mouth of the cave, and suddenly a voice came to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And so sort of at the start and then again at the end of their dealings in this time where God's revealing things to him, God asked the same question. And I want you to notice that God's questions, and also what he reveals, they challenge the negative thinking that Elijah has allowed himself into. They challenge some of those cognitive distortions. Now I want you to think about it. He says, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Well, where is here? It's in the wilderness outside of Beersheba in the country of Judah, running from Jezebel. Now Elijah doesn't really provide a straight answer to the question, and so it's left a little bit to our imaginations. What would he have said? "What are you doing here, Elijah?" "Well, I'm here because Jezebel wants to kill me. I'm here because this enterprise of yours, being a prophet of Jehovah, it's doomed to fail among this people. There's no way I'm coming out of this alive." Can't you see the cognitive distortions there? A little bit of catastrophizing, maybe that all or nothing or black or white thinking is present. And so when God asks the question, Elijah is allowed time to think. Is there any way Queen Jezebel could kill Elijah while God was protecting him? No, certainly not. Had Jezebel and Ahab tried to kill Elijah before or wanted to kill Elijah before? Certainly. When there was drought throughout all the land, when water was scarce and when food was hard to come by, did God take care of Elijah? Yeah, he commanded the ravens to bring him food. How neat would that have been to have a raven come and bring you your lunch? When he's allowed the time to stop and think, this question that God issues has gently nudged him out of this negative way of thinking, to challenge the cognitive distortions that he had allowed to become so present in his mind, and to say, you know what, Jezebel, she couldn't kill me, not unless you willed it. The work of being a prophet of God, it's not doomed to fail, it's success so long as I stand with the truth. And as far as the comment that Elijah made, "I alone am left," let's not forget that in chapter 18, after the showdown at Mount Carmel, all the people cried together with a loud voice, "The Lord, He is God." 1 Kings 18:39, make a note of it. 1 Kings 18:39, "The Lord, He is God." That's a success. Now, it's a cognitive distortion to discount the positive, to minimize the good things that are going on in your life and to focus only on the bad. You can see Elijah's done that. We do that, don't we? We discount the positive. We focus on one negative thing that has become so big, and I alone am left. Really, Elijah, are you? Stop and think about that. All these people cried out, "The Lord, He is God." Surely you can see that's not the case. And so he can try and have a pity party, or he can try and spiral down out of control. He can try and say he's the only faithful one, but it's not true. And through his patience and through his questions, you can see God gently nudging him out of that negative thinking to realize that it's not the case. And there are certain things that you feel and certain things that you think that might paralyze you, that might stop you, that might make you afraid, that might make you discouraged from the work. But when you stop and consider, and maybe if you've got a friend to help you talk it out, think it through, you can see, man, I was so set on that, but that's not the case at all. God has a better way for us. If you look at 11 and 12 through this section, you can see the need to trust in God and also reaching out for help. Now, I mentioned this sort of with an asterisk here. Elijah had been praying. Now, it was sort of a very negative prayer, you understand, but he had been praying to God. We mentioned that he wasn't trying to shoulder all this burden himself or do these things himself. He threw himself at God, casting his cares on God because God cares for him. That is reaching out for help. Now, understanding to trust in God, God reveals to Elijah His power, and it's a great reminder. You can see God, again, as the patient teacher, the patient parent. He's reminding him of the things that he knows already to be the case. And if you're helping someone who's dealing with depression, you need to fill this role. You need to remind them of the things that they know to be the case, and it will help them to challenge, again, that negative thinking. Now, this is one of the more interesting parts of this chapter, right? 1 Kings 19, 11, and 12. Then he said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore into the mountains and broke the rocks in pieces before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. Now, it's a little outside the purpose of this lesson. We could spend a lot of time talking about the different signs and perhaps all the different significances of what God reveals here. But to put it simply, this is what we know to be the case. Elijah had been seeking God in prayer, and Elijah felt powerless and hopeless. God provides many reminders, not just of His great power, but of His comfort, of His care toward Elijah. And I think perhaps that's the most striking thing for us, what should stand out to us. There's a powerful earthquake, there's great wind, there's a great fire, but where is the Lord? He's in that still small voice. To know not just the severity, but the goodness of God. To know God not just as Creator and the one who's ready to dispense wrath on those who are unjust, but to also know Him as the one who is seeking to be strong for you, who seeks to lift up your head, to be your light in the darkness. That is our God. And so God answers, displaying what Elijah needs to be reminded of, that it is only in God where we find true safety, true power, and true healing. Now, if you're the type to take a note on the page in your Bible, let me suggest maybe somewhere around 11 and 12, you can draw an arrow pointing back to verse 2. There's an excellent point of contrast to be made here. In verse 2, again, this is the oath that Jezebel makes. Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time." Question. When Jezebel says the gods, who is she referring to? The Baals. The Baals who were defeated in chapter 18. The Baals who were shown to be powerless, to be nothing. Certainly not with any might to stand before the one true Jehovah God. And so Jezebel, she makes this vow, this oath by the gods, her gods, the Baals, the Ashtaroths. You mean those gods who got beat on Mount Carmel? You mean those gods who are nothing, who are just idols, who are just man's imaginations? Yeah, that's all she had. And you can see the fear sort of melting away when you start to compare and contrast the great and powerful one true God who displays His might in the wind and in the fire and in the earthquake, and who cares enough to speak in that still small voice and wants to lift up your head and comfort you and strengthen you for the task ahead. The one who sends fire from heaven to devour the altar and the water around it and the sacrifice and all of that. Who's stronger? Of course, Jehovah is stronger. And so we know we can trust in God. We know that God brings the victory. And just like Elijah had to be reminded of God's power and reminded of this victory, sometimes we today get fearful of silly things. Sometimes we today get fearful of physical things. Why should the child of God be fearful of physical things when we understand the Eternal One, when we have a relationship with the Eternal One, with the Almighty, and we know that our spiritual home is in heaven? Trust in God. And yes, more time in prayer, more time in Bible study, more time talking about the things of Scripture together with like-minded brothers and sisters, all of these things can help us as a remedy or as prevention for depression. Okay, back down towards the end of the chapter. Look at verse 15. This is where we can tie in performing meaningful service and also the idea, I think, of being sociable here. 1 Kings 19, look at 15 and 16. Then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, anoint Hazael as king over Syria. Also you shall anoint Jehu, the son of Nimshi, as king over Israel. And Elisha, the son of Shaphat, of Abel-Meholah, you shall anoint as prophet in your place." Okay, now we talked about how God takes care of the physical things first, right? Elijah was allowed to eat and drink and rest. He had this time of teaching with all the different signs that were provided. And after the questioning period to help reshape his thinking, this is where God says, "All right, Elijah, here's your job. Here is something for you to do." And sometimes that's such a help when someone's in depression. Here's something you can do. Here's something that you can be busy with. And it is meaningful service. And so there are two kings that he needs to anoint. And then most especially, Elisha is going to be a help and comfort to Elijah. And you can understand, I know we mentioned his servant earlier, but Elijah many times lived a very lonely, very isolated life. And the friendship and the mentor-mentoree relationship that he's going to have with Elisha, it must have been such a comfort, such a help to him. For someone who had been doing the work of the Lord largely alone, now to have a co-worker, now to have a comrade, a brother in arms, if you will, to do the work. I know a lot of preachers who have gone through a period of burnout, a period of just feeling intensely alone and isolated and distressed, and then maybe they come into a new work or come into a new situation where they have other preachers, other ministers alongside them, other people stuck into the work, and they say, "This is so different. You don't realize how lonely I was." Sometimes we don't realize how lonely we are. And so you can see the social aspect here as well, that he's not alone, that he's going to have a helper here. And then also this, just as a key point, the path to real joy involves responsibility. The path to real joy involves obligation and fulfilling that obligation. And so Elijah felt hopeless and helpless and powerless. God says, "Elijah, here's something that you can do. And this is going to be meaningful service. This is going to be good for the workers of truth, for those who are on the side of God." And so that's certainly present here. Then one more that we'll mention, this is the last part, 17 and 18. It is about performing meaningful service. It's also about reaching out for help. Now, we mentioned he was reaching out to God for help with that prayer, but also these two kings that he's going to anoint and Elisha, the fellow prophet, these are going to help him as well. And so as we think about helping ourselves and others through depression, we need to reach out to God and to trained professionals and to good friends for help. There are multiple sources of good help nearby. Okay, let's read 17 and 18. "It shall be that whoever escapes the sword of Hazael, Jehu will kill, and whoever escapes the sword of Jehu, Elisha will kill. Yet I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." And you can see the tie here, meaningful service, and then also the help that's going to be provided, probably more of that being sociable aspect, just to know that he's not alone in this work. And it's such a nice picture, isn't it, to round this out, to take the prophet of God who felt hopeless and unworthy and isolated and alone, and now to understand he's got these champions by his side. He's got these people who are going to help, and you can see really the key way that they're helping is in punishing those who continue to fight against truth. Just like the prophets of Baal were killed in chapter 18, there are more idol worshipers, there are more enemies of Jehovah that are going to be punished by God through these servants. Now, I want to mention this just as kind of a fun inclusion. I was talking with someone after the service this morning. They had been in discussion earlier with another here in worship, and they said, "Well, John's going to talk about dealing with depression this morning." And they said, "What? Killing with oppression?" No, dealing with depression. Well, this is killing with oppression, maybe. We see that evil will be defeated. And I don't want you to lose focus. Really, that, I think, is the overarching idea that God gets into Elijah's head. Evil is going to be defeated. And you're not alone because you're going to have helpers in that. Shouldn't that be a great comfort for us today? To know that whatever we're up against, whatever problems are present, we know, like Elijah learned, evil will be defeated. And God provides for us remedies for our depression. He provides for us ways out of this downward thinking, this negative thinking, so that we can be back doing the work that He has for us to do. And it is meaningful work. It is powerful work. And so when you think about Elijah, he was not just prophet of God, he was a sufferer of depression. But God provided for him the answers that were there, the remedies that were needed, so that he could continue in the work and be effective. Now, let's apply this with what we've talked about this morning to members of the church today. There are Christians, I believe far many than you perhaps realize, who deal with depression, and deal with depression perhaps even on a daily basis. There is no single magic bullet or magic wand that can take away your depression, but you need to know that depression can be overcome. It is overcome through the careful application of biblical principles, and this is a learned skill that we continue to develop, and it's a discipline that we work hard at each and every day. You will be helped in these endeavors by surrounding yourself with good Christian friends. I cannot stress to you enough the benefits of socializing, fellowshipping with people who understand the value of God and His truth, people who are ready to love you like God loves you, people who are willing to show that same patience, and maybe to ask questions to gently challenge those cognitive distortions where your thinking has got too negative, maybe just to sit and listen for a while you vent, while you blow off a little steam and talk yourself back around to the solution. God has put us together in His wisdom for a specific reason, so that we can help one another in the service of the kingdom, and so that we can help one another live faithfully and get to heaven. I pray that I could do better at being that help for you, and I pray that you would do better at being that help for everyone in the church family. Christians will overcome depression through Christ and through what God has revealed in His Word. We're going to trust in God, and we're going to use the good models that we have to learn more about it and to solve it, rather than being afraid to talk about it. Now, I want to close with this. We talked a lot about the stigma this morning. People don't want to admit to feeling depression. People are afraid to make any admission, even to a friend in the pews, don't want to talk about it. And I think mainly that is a fear of man, a fear that those among mankind will look at us differently. I think there's a different fear that needs to be present, that needs to be powerful. I should be fearful of anything affecting my Christian service to the extent that depression does. I should be fearful of anything affecting my usefulness to the kingdom in such a negative extent. And I should be fearful of depression being used as a tool by Satan to isolate me from my brothers and sisters in Christ and ultimately separating me from God. Don't forget, that's Satan's absolute goal, is to keep you separate from God. Let's make sure he doesn't succeed in that work. Let's never be too shy to talk about these problems together, and always do so with a scriptural mindset. If we can assist you in any way tonight, if you're subject to the Lord's invitation, please just come forward and make that need known as together we stand and sing.